Houston, we may have a problem. What is going on, folks? Welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online results and paper events, which we do have a couple of this weekend, and we take a look and see what the heck everybody's playing. What does the metagame look like from last week compared to this week? If we got any spicy deck lists to take a look at. Sometimes we take a look at a couple of winners too, depending on how many interesting decks we have to take a look at, and we will be taking a look at some of the winners this week as well. Before we get started, if you enjoy this type of content, please be sure to let me know in the comments section down below if anything, you guys think anything could be improved. We've been doing this for a while now. I mean, I think about 6 months we've been doing the metagame series, and the feedback is mostly positive so far. It seems that you guys enjoy this type of video, so if you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying, click that subscribe button. It really does help out the channel. But we are going to start, as we always do, with Modern. And I was talking to Houston before the video started, and we do in fact have a problem. Now, if you take a look at this metagame snapshot, it doesn't look that bad, right? Grinding Breach, 16.3%, even down a little bit from last week's 17.5%. Boros Energy, 13.1%. down 4% from last week. Orzhov Blink, roughly around the same. It doesn't look like there's a lot that's changing within those three. But that is because I think people are maybe afraid to play it on Magic Online due to time constraints and just how long it takes to go through all the clicks and physically execute the combo in an online setting. Because in paper, you can just tell your opponent, I've demonstrated a loop, you're dead. And because of that, in the top 32 of the Charlotte Regional Championship, which I was there. If I said hi to you, that was great. I met some awesome people this weekend. In the top 32 of the Charlotte Regional Championship, there were 16 Underworld Breach decks. And by my count, I mean, I'm not the best at math, but I think that's 50% of the top 32, which is kind of absurd. Breach was 6 out of the top 8. We actually were very close to it being 8 out of the top 8, and I really wanted that to happen so bad. But I think we can all agree we are at the point where Modern has reached its sort of conclusion, right? This is what's been happening the past couple of formats, where it was very clear that Nadu was a problem. We had to play with it for a couple of weeks. It was very clear the Ring was a problem. We had to play with it for about a month or so, and we're in that same cycle. So I mean, I understand, and maybe I'll get into this in a different video about ban philosophy and stuff like that, but TLDR, Breach is going to get banned, and we're just kind of left playing a lame duck format for a couple of weeks. But even though it's a lame duck format, we do still have some interesting decks. By the way, I just want to, for posterity's sake, I forgot to include one Breach that won the Charlotte RC. So this list should include one copy of Grinding Breach. So keep that in mind. But as far as deck lists are concerned, I mentioned we had some spice, and I mentioned we were taking a look at some winning deck lists. Well, the first deck list actually happens to be spice that won the entire tournament. So there was another regional championship that took place in Australia, New Zealand region this weekend. Small tournament, only 155 players. But it was won by Thomas Bott, who played this colorless Eldrazi deck. And when you think colorless Eldrazi, you normally associate that with Eldrazi Tron. But there's no Tron here. This is just Glaring Fleshraker, Kozilek's Command. It's even playing enough artifacts to support Mox Opal with Mishra's Bauble and Chalice of the Void and Mind Stone, ramping into Karn. It still has like a fast Emrakul because Kozilek's Command ramps you a bunch. It's got Mystic Forge to pair with Glaring Fleshraker, Mystic Forge in the sideboard as well to go get with Karn. It almost feels like this weird hybrid sort of like aggro prison deck. And what I mean by aggro is that Fleshraker can kill your opponent very quickly. If you have one or multiples in play and you start pairing that with Kozilek's commands, they're going to die very, very quickly to these Fleshrakers. So it sort of like has that element, and then you have the Karn plus Chalice to lock out Breach decks. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. Got some Thought-Knot Seers in the sideboard, Urza Saga deck with Ugin's Labyrinth and Temple. There's even a Fountain Port in this deck, which I thought was kind of cool. And then Darksteel Citadel to help enable Mox Opal. So really cool looking deck list from Thomas Bott. Not entirely sure how something like this is going to fare if and when Breach does get banned, because part of the appeal to this is you're playing Karn and Chalice, which are so phenomenal in the metagame right now. So time will tell on this one, but it's a really, really cool starting place. Frequent user of the channel, Screenwriter NY, is up next in 11th place, and they keep showing up on the channel because they keep making awesome decks. So this is a deck built around Primal Prayers. I believe this might have been initially, this might have been a Spike deck. I think Spike was really working on a Primal Prayers plus Dowerport Mage for a long time, because what Dowerport Mage says, whenever one or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card. So if you bounce it or anything like that, and then there's an infinite combo with Greenbelt Rampager, Dowerport Mage, Primal Prayers to basically draw your entire deck and play Thassa's Oracle. And this is a lot of the same stuff. So you have like Coiling Oracle as a creature that just goes and can find lands, can draw a card. You have some mana ramp with Utopia Sprawl. More importantly, Coiling Oracle is a blue card for Force of Denial as well, or Force of Denial, Flare of Denial. But the big new addition here is 4 copies of Stock Up. And I think it looks pretty good in this deck because you are trying to set up sort of an A plus B/B combo, and Stock Up being able to find 2 of those combo pieces sounds pretty good. So I kind of like that. And the Shardless Agent seems kind of cool in this deck because you can just hit either Coiling Oracle or Dowerport Mage or even Greenbelt Rampager. So it kind of has a somewhat high density or high percentage chance to hit a combo piece, which I think is kind of cool. Shrieking Drake to pick up other creatures, just a lot of cool stuff going on, and Stock Up is making waves in a lot of different formats. Now, everybody wants to talk about what the best Mox Opal deck is after Breach gets banned, and you got to assume Affinity is on that list somewhere, right? Right? I'm not coping. Definitely not. The Nectar is definitely not coping in 5th place here in this challenge. The reason I wanted to highlight this Affinity deck is because there's some new cards here that we may have not seen before. So you kind of have the usual, your 4 Opals, your Urza Saga deck with Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, but you have some interesting new additions here. So first and foremost, Memory Guardian, which is not a card that I've seen every Affinity deck play. This is sort of like an upgraded Somber Hoverguard, if you're old enough to remember that one, because I know I am. But it's also a flyer, right? So now that you have Ornithopter, Memory Guardian, even Tambio has flying, just saying, and Thought Monitor as like cheap flyers to pair with Michiko's Reign of Truth, which is a saga. And on the first 2 chapters, you basically get to have a 1-turn cranial plating of sorts where it counts artifacts and enchantments, which is cool because with those cheap flyers, it sort of imitates cranial plate. If you think about it this way, right? If you have cranial plating in play for 2 turns and a flyer, and you attack them twice with a cranial plating, you probably don't need a 3rd combat step. Most of the time, if you're hitting unblocked with a plating twice, it's going to lead to a victory anyways. So the fact that this doesn't plating a 3rd time is kind of irrelevant, and it flips into a giant creature. The backside, I believe, is just star, which is power and toughness equal to the number of, I think it's artifacts and enchantments. I can't flip this one here. But yeah, I like that. And then Case of the Filch Falcon is another weird one where it is 1 mana for an enchantment and an artifact. So it has 2 permanents for Michiko's Reign of Truth, and it also gives you cheap artifact and way to make a flyer later on. So if you are interested in Affinity, this is maybe a good place to start. And last but not least, from Senor Larson in 29th place, I've seen some Monument to Endurance decks, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe this was initially a Spike deck, because I know he was spending a lot of time working on Monument. And the idea is that Monument to Endurance works very, very well with the Underworld Cookbook, because Cookbook allows you to discard cards on your turn and your opponent's turn. You have Street Wraith for free discard. You have Marauding Mako to pay you off for discarding, as well as Inti. You got some Asmos, some Faithless Lootings to help another card that's just absurd with Monument, because you get to trigger it twice and then have maybe discards on their turn. Urza Saga paired with Galvanic Blast. Lot to like about this deck. And perhaps another contender for good Opal deck after the Breach ban? Only time will tell. Now that Modern is out of the way, let us take a look at Pioneer. So last week was 20% Rakdos Demons. We're down a little bit from last week. We've gone from 20 to 16, which is not bad. I'll take that, 20 to 16. Gruul Prowess still roughly around 16%. Dimir Bounce 13. It's a bit of an uptick from last week. Is it Phoenix 5%? Most of this stuff is the same. Slight uptick in Enigmatic from what 2.5 to 6.3%. Rakdos Prowess, which I don't even see last week. It looks like 1.3 to 3.8, so a small uptick. And one that you'll notice that in the top left, Orzhov Zombies. Last week, we called that DNP, did not participate. There was no Orzhov Zombies decks. And now, 5% this week. And that is the exact MTGO phenomenon that I've been referencing a couple of times, where a deck does well in the very first challenge of the weekend, and then more and more copies of that deck throughout the weekend. And if you didn't already guess, that's where we're going to start with deck list, by the way. So King Harry got second place in the Friday challenge with Orzhov Zombies. Now, this is something that I hadn't really thought about with Zahur Glory's Past as a sort of new sacrifice outlet. Where Zahur is, it does only let you do it once per turn, which is kind of awkward. But once you get to max speed, you have this insanely powerful ability that says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you get a 2/2 zombie. So whenever if you have Zahur in play, once you get to that 4 speed, which to be honest with you is pretty easy to do because you have Wayward Servant for drains and just an endless amount of 1-drops like Dreadwanderer, Cryptbreaker, and Champion of the Perished, which are all phenomenal 1-drops, by the way. Getting to play both Champion and Cryptbreaker, very, very high quality 1-drops. You have Relentless Dead on 2 for Menace, Unstoppable Slasher, which happens to be a zombie and is just an extremely powerful card, even without the Bloodletters. And pairing it with the classic Thoughtseize Fatal Push, and another removal spell that you may have forgotten about, but believe it or not, this card won a Pro Tour. Dark Salvation is fantastic because if you have zombies in play, you can cast it for 1 mana just to have a kill spell. But as you flood out, and decks like this typically do, as you'll notice, there's 24 lands in this deck, where we're playing a bunch of 1 and 2 drops. Why are we doing that? Well, that's because you have this as flood insurance. Some lists play Mutavault. This one does not, which kind of makes sense because you have Wayward Servant and Zahur, so you can't really afford to have colorless lands. But it is playing 2 Hives, and that is a way to kind of mitigate flooding a little bit, and 1 Copter as well. So really, really sick looking deck here. If I ever decide to play Pioneer, which by the way, I have seen your comments in the YouTube comments. I know there's been some people asking me for some Pioneer content, and with Champion of the Perished and Dark Salvation, you just might be getting that Pioneer content. Apparently, we've walked onto the set of a Jurassic Park film. 25th place, Odorous Urungus. This is dinosaurs. That's it, dinosaurs. Now, a lot of these cards do happen to be standard legal. So Rampaging Raptor, 4/4 Trample Haste, gets pumped. Regal Imperiosaur, this is kind of the new Aetherdrift card that I would imagine had sort of sparked this idea for Odorous. And I mean, it's a banger, right? 3 mana for a 5/4 that pumps all of your other dinosaurs. It's really good stats if you can find enough good dinosaurs. Now, let's talk about the cards that are not standard legal, as those are the ones that we want to kind of take a look at and see what upgrades do we get from standard. Because I remember when I played this deck in standard, it was not very good. So you get an additional elf. We're playing Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves. Only 6 total, but you do get an additional copy. And more importantly, Marauding Raptor. So this is a 2/3 that says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield, the Raptor deals 2 to it. And if a dinosaur is dealt damage this way, the Raptor gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Now, you'll notice that all of your dinosaurs that would trigger the Raptor all have more than 2 toughness. Hammer Skull Raptor, Imperiosaur, so on and so forth. So all of that stuff does not die to the Marauding Raptor, and it makes all of your stuff cheaper. So really good combo. Regisaur Alpha, phenomenal card, gives all other dinosaurs haste, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a 3/3 trample. So it is 5 mana for a 3/3 trample that gives all of your other dinosaurs haste. Haste, really good on Galta Primal Hunger. And then the other new dinosaur here that's not legal in standard is Ripjaw Raptor. So it's a 4 or 5. Whenever it's dealt damage, you draw a card. really good with the aforementioned Marauding Raptor. And honestly, probably the most important card that we do not currently have access to in Standard is Commune, because this just, if you think about it, it says Commune is look at the top 5, reveal a dinosaur or land. There's only 8 cards in this deck that are not dinosaurs or lands. Well, I guess that's not true because you have the elves. So 14 cards that are not dinosaurs or lands, but you get the idea. A 2 or 3/4 of your deck is hits for Commune, so you're almost always going to find exactly what you need. Not entirely sure if this can compete with stuff like Rakdos Demons and Gruul Prowess and Dimir Bounce, but it's at least a really, really cool take, and definitely something to do with those Regal Imperiosaurs that you may have bought for Standard, even though they're not as good in Standard. And last up here for Pioneer, we have Alberto SD in 29th place with Esper Oculus? This is a modern deck? Not quite. So you kind of have a lot of similar things going on to, well, actually, now that I think about it, there is not a single reanimation spell on this deck. I was wondering if there was going to be a copy of No One Left Behind, which is the 5 mana card that costs 3 less if you target a CMC 3 or less. So it's 2 mana reanimate Oculus. But no, we're just casting Oculus the hard way. With self-mill like Bailmerk and Picklock Prankster, we have Tainted Indulgence to help put cards in the graveyard, consider as well. And then you're kind of pairing that with Ketramos, because Ketramos works very well with Oculus. If you have Ketramos in play, when you cast Oculus, you exile the cards from the graveyard. That triggers the Ketramos. You also have Scrabbling Claws, which helps you trigger Ketramos even more, and it gives you some cool main deck graveyard hate. There's the couple of Shieldrids, a Beza, and then just kind of your generic kill spells, Anoint, Push, Ride's End, which is interesting and funny to see Ride's End without Up the Beanstalk in it. But yeah, Ride's End is here as well, just as, I think most importantly, this exiles, and that's very, very big against stuff like Heartfire Hero, and Gruul is one of the most played decks in Pioneer right now, so that does make a lot of sense. And it also exiles, so if you cast it on your main phase, trigger Ketramos. Same thing with Vanishing Verse. And then some Surveillance to help fuel the Oculuses as well. And some sideboard cards, Elish Norn, Temp Lockdown, Thoughtseize. So, interesting take on kind of the Oculus deck. It is very strange to see an Oculus deck without any reanimation spells. So, maybe between the Picklocks and the Tainteds, you could play a couple of copies of the No One Left Behind, or now that you're playing Esper, you could even just play Helping Hand. But anyways, cool take from Alberto SD. It's time to go into Standard next. Pixie, 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 Pixie. You get the idea. Look, I don't really know what happened, but ever since the Pro Tour, right? Domain won the Pro Tour. People were playing. There was a huge uptick in Domain for a decent period, for maybe about a couple of days or one weekend. And I guess we're just back to Pixie now. As you can see, Pixie won 3 of the 4 challenges this weekend. It went from 11.9% to 20.3%. Domain kicking around the same, Gruul kicking around the same. So it's not even like less people are playing Gruul and Domain, and those players are switching to Esper. It's people are just not trying other stuff, and those people are actually the ones switching to Esper. So yeah, it's a bit interesting here. Azorius about the same, Mono Red about the same. Nothing else really worth noting. Omniscience, pretty big uptick. It did win one of the challenges. Standard's in a weird spot because I'm not really sure how, like, if and when the metagame will adjust before the new set, right? Because I think a lot of people thought that Aether Drift was going to make more of an impact than it has. To be honest with you, there's not really a ton of fantastic cards in Aether Drift. There's Ketramos, but not really good enough for Standard. There's just not enough ways to enable it. There's Stock Up, there's the Gear Hulks. Like, there's a couple of good cards, but not really enough to kind of overtake the Monstrous Rage, Up the Beanstalk, This Town Ain't Big Enough stranglehold that those have on the farm app. So for now, I think we're going to be playing a lot of those 3 decks in the near future, but we do have some interesting ones to take a look at. And by interesting, I mean very interesting. So first one I want to show you here from Tulio Jodi. Tulio has a long history of making really sweet decks, and this one, no different. So we have the crime package, Free Strider Lookout pairing with, oh, we actually do not have the creature. I just kind of assumed there was the Iridescent Vine Lasher. That one's not here. But we do have plenty of ways to trigger crimes. We have Anoint, cut all the kill spells, Outrageous Robbery, 4 copies of Cease and Desist, which is main deck graveyard hate, way to trigger crimes, and 6 mana win the game against domain. Well, not win the game, but 6 mana basically win the game against domain. It's pretty good. You have Cover Up for Sweepers, Duress, Tactics, and Pulse. So plenty of ways to commit crimes for Free Strider. Now, you might ask yourself, well, if we don't have the Iridescent Vine Lasher, what are we doing with all these lands? I bet you didn't know this, but Corrupt is legal in Standard. This is a card that was printed all the way back in, I think Urza Block was the first printing. Let me know in the comments if I got that right. But Corrupt, it deals damage to any target equal to the number of swamps you control, and you gain that much life. So, if you put a bunch of lands into play with Free Strider Lookout, you can just burn them out with Corrupt because you get the swamps and the mana to cast the 6 mana Corrupt. And I don't know if you know this, but you have 12 swamps, which you might think to yourself, well, that doesn't sound like enough. Well, I got 4 underground mortuaries, 16 out of 27. If you still think that that's not enough, what if I told you Haunted Mire? I didn't even know these lands were legal, but apparently there is just a cycle of ETB tap lands that are also typed. So we have 20 swamps, even though we only have 12 basics, which allow us to cast those green cards and so on and so forth. Really interesting take on kind of the crimes archetype. It does feel very, very strange to see a crimes deck that does not have Iridescent Vine Lasher, but you know, I do like the idea of just casting a bunch of corrupts. I'm in for it, so may have to give this one a try. I did mention earlier that Ketramos was not seeing play in Standard, and I may have lied. Well, I didn't lie, but this is the first weekend that it really kind of started to take off a little bit. So the initial list that I saw was from, I believe it was a 5-0 in one of the re-CQs at SCG Con Charlotte. I don't remember the name of the person who 5-0'd with it. I apologize. But I believe this might be a carbon copy of that list. And the idea is that you are playing 4 Ketramos and then just a stack of removal spells, right? You have 4 Temp Lockdown, which happens to trigger Ketramos, 2 Anoint, 2 Parting Gust to the end, all kill spells that trigger Ketramos, Deadly Cover Up, Legions to Ashes, and Soul Search, which is a really, really cool one. Funny enough, Soul Search does not trigger Ketramos because Ketramos says battlefield or graveyard, and Soul Search removes a card from the hand, so keep that in mind. But it is a discard spell. If you take a card with mana value 1 or less, you get a Spirit, and it's a way to exile 1 extra card to get closer to 7 for Ketramos. We have a couple of Cease and Desists, not only good in crimes, but also good at exiling cards for Ketramos, and 1 Kaya Intangible Slayer, a couple of Bazes, and then Maze Mind Tome, which is a really cool one because it's card advantage if you need it, if you have the extra mana. If you don't have any extra mana lying around, it can just be a way to scry, gain 4 life, and then on the last counter, the tome exiles itself, not sacrifice, which means, you guessed it, triggering Ketramos. So a lot of ways to exile and draw a whole bunch of cards with Ketramos. My only fear about a deck that looks like this is there's not enough win conditions, but maybe I'm sort of misevaluating how often Ketramos is even dying in the first place. But I would love to give this one a shot because I've been trying to find a good Ketramos deck in Standard, and this one looks like it might be it. And last but certainly not least, from Aku Adama in 21st place. Now, if you've been watching the channel since the release of Aether Drift, you might notice that early on, I was very, very, very high on Loot the Pathfinder, specifically combined with Agatha Soul Cauldron, because Loot has 3 extremely powerful abilities. Make mana, draw 3 cards, deal 3 damage. And every Cauldron version with Loot I tried, every single version I tried, it was not quite there, not quite good enough. And I think part of the reason was that it didn't have a good enough backup plan. This deck has 2 backup plans to the Loot. It's almost like Loot Cauldron is an afterthought to the other plans in this deck. We'll get there. So The first backup plan, if you want to call it that, is Prof's Eidetic Memory, where if you have Profs in play and you draw a bunch of extra cards, you get some counters, which we have some ways to do that. We have Fear of Missing Out and Steam Core Scholar. Those are kind of the two big ones. And it just so happens that Monument to Endurance also draws extra cards. Also, turns out Monument to Endurance is good with discarding cards. Hey, guess what discards cards? Are cards that also pay us off for playing Prof's Eidetic Memory. Also, discarding cards, good to put loot into the graveyard. So it's almost like this individual kind of just put it all together in a way that I couldn't before, because this, I gotta tell you, this deck looks, like when I look at it on paper, it looks perfect. Like this is exactly what I want a Cauldron loot deck to look like, and I can't wait to try this one. Expect a video from this one in the near future, because this one looks sick and I cannot wait to try it. And that, my friends, is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the content, leave a like, and until next week, adios.